joining us virtually today. So unfortunately, she's not here in person with us, but it's pretty close to being the same. And so I'll turn it over to her and let her go along with her talk. If you guys got any questions, she'll have some time, hopefully at the end, I'm sure, for questions. But if there's something you do want to have asked in the middle, let me know. If you speak up really loud, she'll be able to hear through the computer microphone, or I can repeat the question as well. So, all right, thanks, Abby.
Thanks, Adam. Hello, everyone. Hi. Thanks again to Adam and the New York Association for having me, and also allowing me to be here remotely, although I prefer to be there, certainly. And thank you all for coming to this talk. Before I start, there's a really important question I have to ask, though. Is Peter Gregg somewhere in that room? All right.
I don't see Peter.
What's that?
I don't see Peter.
Okay, well, I'll take that up with him later. We had a long talk about this full talk about this research before a couple of weeks ago. So I know he's looking forward to hear it. Anyway, so today this is going to be, if any of you were in my previous talk, which is about a whole bunch of different research, this is changing gears almost entirely to talk about one research project. And so we are going to talk about the answer to this question, why red? And specifically looking at yields from red maple trees. So to answer the question, like, why would I spend several years studying just red maple? There are a bunch of different reasons. And one of those is, first and foremost, starting out with the native range of red maple is much larger and wider than the native range of sugar maple. So we have red maple present in a lot of areas, both within the sort of traditional maple producing areas, but also sort of on the outskirts of that. So it is widely present in our existing sugar bushes and sugar bushes potentially of the future. And one of the reasons it does have such a widespread range is that within that large range, we find red maple on a wide variety of site conditions. It is adaptable to grow in places everywhere from full-on swamps to dry ridge tops and everything in between. It is, it may not compete the best on all of those places, in all of those places. It has places where it would prefer to grow, but it will persist, and it is able to keep up in lots of these different environments. So we find it again in a lot of different sites. And a big impetus for looking at red maple is that we see red maple as a huge component of the potential taps to be added, again, in the current areas of maple production and also a little bit outside of that. This is from a study done a few years ago by Dr. Mike Farrell. And so he identified the number of potential untapped sugar and red maple trees throughout both the maple producing regions and states without current maple production. And so in a lot of states, both in and outside of sort of commercial maple production areas, red maple makes up a huge component of the potential tap. So it is an extraordinarily large potential resource for our industry, just as it stands today. And since we're in New York today, just taking a quick look at the red maple resource in stands where they're at a tappable density, you can see that the red maple resource that of untapped trees in New York is bigger than the sugar maple resource. So, and that's the case for a lot of areas in the maple producing region. And as we move further south, that difference becomes even bigger and bigger. And another great reason why we want to think about red maple is that it is, even though it's a maple tree, having it present in our sugar bushes actually adds diversity and resilience to our sugar bushes. And I love this picture. It is a great example of this potential for red maple. This was taken by my colleague, Mark Islehart, UVM's maple extension specialist. This is in a stand where a couple of years ago, when we were having a large forest tent caterpillar outbreak in certain areas of Vermont, what you can see here is a sugar maple tree that has been completely defoliated by those caterpillars, and it is surrounded by red maples that they have not even touched. And this is the case for many things. There are going to be certain pests that red maple is more resilient to than sugar maple, and vice versa. They are not necessarily affected by the same suite of pests and diseases in the same way. They are in many ways very different species. So by having red maples in our areas of production, this potentially adds some resilience to our areas of production that in addition to having just sugar maple, if something were to come along and affect sugar maple, or vice versa, of course. And then another huge reason why we're thinking about red maple. So most of what I've talked about already has to do with maple production today, but we are also, of course, thinking about maple production in the future. And for all of the reasons that we talked about, that red maple having a big range and being very adaptable to a number of different types of sites, this makes red maple basically lined up to, or at least predicted, to fare much better in response to climate change than sugar maple. So in many areas where sugar maple is dominant today, red maple is likely to do better as the climate changes. So it will, in all likelihood, even for those of us in the sort of sugar maple sweet spots, red maple is going to continue to become an increasingly more important part of our maple operations. So there are lots of great reasons to study red maple and to look at adding this as a crop tree, and maybe some of the reasons why we wouldn't. And the question, so basically, like, why not red maple is the other question. And really what we see is that among some people, there are some lingering perceptions of red maple as a sort of less than species for maple production, that it's just not as good. And some people will literally go as far as to walk right past them and not tap them. And so what are some of these perceptions? Some of it has to do with the fact that there is a lower sap sugar concentration, and we'll discuss that in a moment, and that may translate into overall lower yields relative to sugar maple, so not worth tapping. There are some other perceptions that have to do with flavor. Some perceptions that they tend to produce more buddy flavor or stop running earlier, or simply that their flavor is different or somehow inferior. And I will talk more in detail about the logic or illogic of some of these as we go along. But the question, for the overarching question, is whether any of these are actually true. Many of these are based on sort of anecdotal experiences or nothing when it actually comes down to it. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But what we don't have or didn't have was a lot of data to back up that these things are sort of all wives' tales. Especially when it comes to what practices we're currently using. So the overall goal of this whole project was to provide some basic data to actually assess those lingering beliefs about red maple. So to provide data, determine the total yield from red maple trees, and also to look at the flavor of syrup produced with red maple sap. And overall, the sort of impetus for doing this is to provide a means to increase overall operation yield, especially in areas with a large red maple large red maple resource, by increasing the use of red maple as a crop tree. Like I said, there are some people, I'm sure there's some people in that room today that are reluctant, at least, to tap a red maple. So what I'm going to talk about today is the first part of this study, looking at what are the actual total yields from red maple trees. Because certainly we do observe in many cases a lower sap sugar content, so lower sap sugar concentration in red maples as we go through our woods. And over time, probably all of us have looked at that at some point if we are tapping a red maple with a bucket in our operations. But we also know that red maples tend to make a copious amount of sap. So in the very end, at least my hypothesis in the beginning, is that the total yields from red maple trees are balanced out. Perhaps a lower sap sugar concentration, but also more sap. So at the end of the year, the end of the season, you have the same overall amount of syrup production. And this study was basically designed to put that to the test. And so to do this, to determine the total yield from red maple trees, we had 10 red maple trees in each of 5 diameter classes. So we're all the way from 9 up to just under 19 inches. They are all in the same stand, healthy, dominant or co-dominant. So, no struggling trees here. We also have sugar maples in the same size classes in the same stand, so mixed. Each tree gets a separate sap collection chamber. I'm looking for my pointer here. Each tree gets a separate sap collection chamber like this one. This allows us to quantify both the volume and the sap sugar concentration from an individual tree under vacuum conditions. So the whole system had very good levels of vacuum. Each tree got a new check valve spout each year and used a 2-inch tapping depth. And so basically, once they're tapped in each year, each time the sap flows, or because we're using red maple, sometimes twice, good God, each time the sap flows, we're measuring the total volume of sap produced, as well as measuring its sap sugar concentration. And so then for each tree, we can then sum up the total yield for that tree. And at the very end of the season, we can then also take the average total yield for each diameter class. And of course, as I often mention and mentioned earlier in my talk, doing a study like this, especially with yields in maple production, it's really important to do more than 1 year, because the weather conditions in 1 year might lend themselves to very different production than they might in a different year, which will be obvious in the case of this study, which was done for 2 years in 2020 and 2021. Okay, so let's look at 2020 first, which was, in hindsight, a much more typical year. So these trees were tapped in about in mid-February. This is the standard tapping time for our operation at the Proctor Center. And the season ended on April 8th. And you can see there's a number of decent sap flow days during that period. It was all in all a very good year for production in the area of the Proctor Center. And so here, just kind of cutting to the chase here, these are the total syrup yields. It could be gallons of syrup equivalent for each of our size classes. So remember here, in each of these size classes, there are 10 red maple trees. And what you can see without really knowing anything else is that these yields were pretty darn good. Even our 9 to 11 inch trees are getting just under 0.6 gallons of syrup per tree. And up in our larger size classes, we're at a gallon of syrup equivalent per tree. Now, this isn't something special about red maple. This is in part one of the effects of doing a single chamber study. You have no losses in that system, excellent vacuum, excellent sanitation. So getting really good yields is not that weird in a situation like this. But of course, to give this red maple data, without any context, we can see these are great yields. But how did they compare to the sugar maple trees in the same stand? And in 2020, here we're going to add that in. Our sugar maples in the same size classes are in green. You can see that the red maple and sugar maple yields were very similar to one another within the same size classes. And in fact, the yields were not statistically significantly different. They were, for all intents and purposes, the same between reds and sugar maples of the same size in the same stand, which is awesome. You can note here, though, in this year, we did not have a lot of sugar maples in those higher size classes. This is in part because they were being used for other research in that stand. So in the year following this, we were able to add more sugar maples in to get a more robust estimate. But just looking at this year one, and if we kind of take that all together and look at the averages for all the trees, all the red maples and sugar maples, from size class 9 to just under 17 inches, you can see that the averages for reds and sugar maples in that stand were very similar. In fact, they were not statistically different from one another. And in this year, those yields were very, very good. So just another way to express this data, these are the individual trees, and here is based on diameter and their total yield based on diameter. Sugar maple here is in green and red maple is in blue. That's funny, red is in blue. Sorry. But what you can see with these lines, they're nearly parallel to one another and very, very close. So not only were the yields from sugar and red maples very similar to one another, but their pattern of increase in yield with size was also very similar to one another. So really, they're behaving, for all intents and purposes, identically or near identically to one another. Okay, so some other notes from that season. The sap flow stopped in both species at the same time. So that was a year, and this can happen from time to time, where sap flow just ceases before buddy develops. So we didn't notice anything at all about red maples stopping earlier than sugar maples. And obviously we noted nothing about buddy flavor because it didn't develop in either species. 2020 was, of course, our first year of COVID, where we were very locked down. And for that reason, the data collection that we were able to do that year wasn't at a level sufficient enough for me to calculate daily sap yields and sugar concentrations. So we weren't able to do that year. And also, like I said, we didn't have very many sugar maples for those larger size classes. So we really wanted to, in 2021, repeat the study. Of course, we would repeat it no matter what, but we really wanted to add those additional sugar maples in once they were freed up from the other experiment, to get a more robust estimate of the yields from the sugar maples of the same size classes in the same stand. And also, with things a little bit more loose and everything flowing a little bit more nicely, we were able to get more detailed daily sap collection data. So 2021, a star year, a year of note for many different reasons. But from the maple production standpoint, it was of note, not for great reasons. It was literally the worst year for yields that we had at the Proctor Center since we switched to a modern sap collection system with good vacuum and good setup. Basically, our target is about a half gallon, our minimum target is a half gallon of syrup per tap, which we are typically able to achieve regardless of what Mother Nature throws at us, with the exception of 2012, which was also an interesting year. 2021, we didn't even come close to that. And there were a variety of reasons for that. One of them having to do with very few sap flow days once we tapped in, and also very warm weather. And I'm excited, all of you should come to Joel's talk later, because he is going to discuss exactly how we can manage our operations to prevent losses in situations like this. Losses like we experience, such as from ropey syrup. Anyway, bringing it back to red maple for the moment, what this meant for our study, well, I mean, it was an interesting season to observe maybe how red maples and sugar maples behaved, but overall what it meant was the yields from all of our trees were lower than they would have been in a typical season. So again, here's the 2021 data for those same red maple trees, and you can see that essentially the same pattern holds. Generally, you're getting higher yields for with the larger size classes, but the yields are much lower than they were the year before, about 0.2 of a gallon of syrup per tap lower. When we look at the sugar maples in the same stand, they were similarly lower. So again, the yields were fairly similar between the species in each of the different size classes. And from a statistical standpoint, the yields from the two species were not different from one another. So basically, even though the yields were lower, they were the same. between red maples and sugar maples. And again, if we kind of bring that back, putting all of the data into one bucket, looking at the overall average from all the size classes from 9 to 17 inches, you can see again that the average yields for red and sugar maple were not different from one another. However, they were substantially lower than they were the previous year. So we can look at those together. Here's our 2020 yields with red and sugar maple, and here are our 2021 yields. So the take-home message is the yields were not different between red maples and sugar maples. When yields were good, they were both good, and when conditions for yields were not so good, they both tanked in the same way. Looking again at that size versus yield graph, here the 2020 data are in red and gray, and the 2021 data in blue and green. And again, you see those very parallel lines, meaning that the relationship between size and yield is identical between red and sugar maple. We see a little bit of separation between the yields from sugar and red maple. But again, that difference is not statistically significant. So looking at yields across the season, again, because one of the thoughts about red maple is that they perform differently across the season from sugar maples, that they stop running earlier. I have to say we have to use caution. Looking at data early in the season, data in these red boxes, are times when we didn't have a full suite of measurements because of frozen sap in chambers and things like that. So kind of ignore the red boxes, but looking at the yields across the season for our red maples that are in green and sugar maples that are purple here, basically what you can see is, although there's some difference and back and forth between the two, essentially the patterns are the same. They're producing the same amount of yield across the season, whether it's the beginning or the end. There's no separation or difference between how they run across that season. They basically, the sap is flowing when it's flowing, whether it's a sugar maple or a red maple, and it did not stop any earlier in either the 2 years that we studied this. Sap sugar concentration. Now, we do see that there is a consistent pattern of red maple being lower sap sugar concentration than sugar maple. However, it's not a drastically huge difference. It's a fairly slight difference. Sometimes it's bigger than others. But then when we go to look at the sap volume, we see the opposite relationship. We see that red maple, at least on occasion, is producing more sap volume than the sugar maple. But again, not by huge amounts. The differences were not as pronounced as I would have expected them. Then, with the caveat that this was one season, because we didn't have this kind of data resolution for 2020. But again, in the end, it is functionally for most of us about how much syrup we produce with a particular tree. And in the case of this study, we see that we're producing the same amount of syrup with a red maple as we are with a sugar maple of the same size and quality. So the conclusions that we have essentially from these data at this site, healthy trees, all else being equal, the potential or fundamental total yields from red maples are not only very good, they are similar. In other words, not significantly different from total yield from sugar maple. And at least in the 2 years of study that we did in this stand, in this climate, there is no indication that they stopped flowing earlier than one another in the same stand. So that kind of addresses the yield perceptions. Obviously, the next big question has to do with flavor. So right now we are gearing up for an experiment in which we will make syrup simultaneously in identical evaporators with identical conditions from pure red maple sap and pure sugar maple sap, and they will be concentrated to the same sugar concentration. Because at least in my estimation, one of the reasons there may have been a thought about that red maple produced syrup with different flavor could have stemmed from when we're producing syrup before we have RO. If we do have with red maple a larger volume of less concentrated sap, it will require more residence time in the evaporator than sugar maple sap, which may be more concentrated at a lower volume. So that difference in the length of processing, even just right there, could have potentially produced some differences in flavor. And that thought, that observation has potentially lingered. Anyway, what we'll do this year, they'll be concentrated to the same level, so that will not be a variable. And what we'll do, we'll produce syrup simultaneously, and we will do sensory evaluation experiments to see if any difference in flavor can be detected between the two. And if there is a difference in flavor, we'll follow up with other sensory experiments to determine what the nature of that difference might be. But first, we need to actually see whether there's a difference there or not. And we'll also be doing the study, we'll be making syrup at the beginning of the season, the middle of the season, and toward the end of the season also, to make sure that we account for that part of the season where, you know, if they're going to make buddy syrup earlier, we would catch that. But again, even in the yield study, we're seeing that that is unlikely to be the case, at least based on the observations in that study. Okay, before you go out, we all go out and tap red maples and make them the star of future maple production. There are some special factors to consider. One of them is that red maples tend to have this larger central column of discolored or non-conductive wood. So it is not, they don't all have this, but they can have it. It does tend to be in trees that have had stump sprouts, which also can tend to happen more often in certain environments than others, but it is difficult to predict. So in essence, the best thing that we can offer at this moment is to proceed with caution in terms of tapping depth and red maples, especially if you know you've been cutting down some other red maples in that area and you've seen a lot of this. You can at least get an idea that some of its neighbors may have that going on for them too. And it is also possible that by having that large column, that is not a lot of area of conductive sapwood in those trees. So it is possible that trees with this phenotype could have an effect on yields when that column is present. So just some thoughts, some things to think about. Something to think about when you're out there looking at your trees and it's getting to be toward the end of the season and you start seeing red and freaking out about the end of the season. It's worth noting that what you are seeing first with red maple are the floral buds and not the vegetative buds. Now, truth that a bud breaking or beginning the exit of its dormancy is also an indication that the tree is exiting dormancy. So functionally, it could mean the same thing as a vegetative bud, but I think it is important for us to take note that it is not a leaf bud. It is floral buds that we're seeing as the first red, the first swelling of buds when we are out there in the woods and start to get a little bit panicked about the season is over and buddy is going to happen. There's actually no known relationship there. And Tapo wound, so the non-conductive wood generated by Tapo wounds in red maple, there are, especially knowing that they have this tendency to produce that central column of non-conductive wood, it is an important thing to think about. What do Tapo wounds look like in red maple? And my former colleague, Tim Wilmot, who was the previous UVM maple extension specialist, did a good study looking at this, looking at the volume of non-conductive wood generated by Tapo wounds in red maple. And what he found was, broadly speaking, clean Tapo wounds, as in taples made into clear sapwood in red maple. In his study, they were generally very similar in volume to those in sugar maple. So that was encouraging. So basically, all things being equal with clean taples, there's no greater wounding in red maple than in sugar maple, according to his research. But like I mentioned earlier, he also found that tendency for that larger column of discolored wood, and also large stains from early wounds that interact with it. This is especially true because red maple is a stump sprouter. So if that particular tree had stump sprouts that have subsequently died, small branches or branches that are lower that have subsequently died, those have a tendency, as you can see here, to interact with that central column, and that will make a whole lot of non-conductive wood on its own. And of course, if you are tapping into that tree, the stain or the response to the Tapo wound is also likely to interact with that and generate a lot more non-conductive wood than would be developed in response to a clean tapple or a tapple into clean wood. So it's just something to think about. As is, we see a lot of this with that really smooth bark red maple. We often see these kind of what we call frost cracks. And what Tim found in his studies was that even though this can be very alarming when we see it on the bark of the tree, what he found was that internally, the non-conductive wood generated in response to tap holes that had this kind of fissure were generally just normal, that this was really a superficial injury to the bark. I don't know that that's necessarily always the case, but at least it was in the trees that he looked at in this study. So other things to think about with respect to red maple, like I've said a couple of times, it's not a sugar maple. It does not have the same growth preferences as sugar maple. And so when we start thinking long-term and future, obviously silvicultural practices to promote the health and regeneration of red maple are likely going to be different than they are going to be for sugar maple. They're also not as long-lived as sugar maple, so that's something to think about. And they do tend to be, they're called soft maple for a lot of different reasons, and they do have a tendency to, do things like a little bit more breakage in storms. A lot of people will notice that. So, there are differences in the care and feeding, I would say, I guess, of red maple that are important to keep in mind. And with that, that is all I have on this, and I would love to take questions if anybody has them.
Thank you, Abby. Does anybody have any questions for Abby?
Does she look at silver maple at all?
Nope, just reds.
There's Ohio State, there's some researchers there that are looking at the hybrid red silvers. Are they also looking at straight silvers, Abby?
Yes, they, in their study, which I highly recommend checking out if the presentation is available online, I believe they have reds, the hybrid rilvers, and silvers in the same stand, that they are doing very careful individual sap tree collection measurements on, similar to what was done here. So all in the same stand, et cetera. So I would look to those. And so far, I don't know that they've found a difference, but don't quote me on that. My memory is not so good on that one.
Question I have has to do with grading and your color. Do you find any difference in grading with red versus sugar? The color?
In terms of syrup?
Yes.
we have not done our flavor study yet. So that'll be, I can answer that question in a year from now.
I guess I'm not talking about the flavor, but the color.
Right, we'll look at color too in that study, but as of now, there are no data on color differences between red, syrup made with red and sugar maple sap, because that experiment has never been done before in actual commercial equipment. So I'll tell you in a year.
Okay.
Same with the issue of like niter and, you know, all of those questions that people have said, oh, there's more niter with red maple, oh, there's different color or a softer flavor. Like there are lots of things people say about that, but we really don't have the experiment to back it up. So I hope to illuminate me and all of us on that in the next year.
Thank you.
Are there any recommended modifications to the tapping practices? Maybe go an inch and a half or an inch with a larger diameter hole, or not enough data to speculate on that?
I didn't quite catch actually any of that.
The question has to do, because of the larger heartwood, is it recommended to maybe not drill as deep and then maybe go with a larger diameter hole, or do you not have data to answer that question yet?
I would definitely not recommend going with a larger diameter hole, because if you do have a tree with all that central column and very little sapwood, that larger diameter is going to screw you. So you want to stick with a 5/16 or, you know, smaller if needed. It wouldn't be a bad idea to back off a little bit on tapping depth, especially like, as I said, if you know you're in an area, you've done some thinning, you've seen other red maples in the same stand have that central column, that's a fairly good indication that some of its remaining neighbors that are your crop trees might have it too. So you could start by being a little more conservative with depth, maybe an inch and a half. And then you can also do some trial and error. You know, at some point you are, you know, if you decide I'm going to go 2 inches, I don't know anything about these trees, I'll just start with 2 inches. You're going to see pretty soon whether or not you're encountering that central column. So at some level, you'll be able to adjust your practices based on what you see.
So maybe try inch and a half to start with, you're getting that non-conductive center, back it off before it's go.
Right, or start with 2. If you have no evidence to the contrary that central column is there, start with 2. If you're hitting clean wood all the way through, then you could be safe to do that.
So watching your shavings, looking at the color of the shavings.
Definitely. The caveat there is if you're close to the center, even if you don't hit it, you could end up having those 2 stains interact and kind of explode. So there is some reason to err towards the more conservative side on depth, but I hate to say that as just a general rule, because I don't want to recommend being overly conservative when it's not necessary. Like my goal here is to like give you all the possible factors and allow you to adjust based on based on your trees, like based on their growth rates, based on what you see. So yeah, you've got all the information and you can, you know, use what fits for your whole situation.
Is there any data on the amount of years it takes for a red versus a sugar to grow to a tappable diameter?
That is going to be variable so much on the site and the conditions. Yes, generally speaking, if you had everything equal on the same site, and I mean everything equal, red maples as juveniles do tend to grow faster than sugar maples, but it's like useless for me to say that because there's never all factors being equal, even in your own same sugar woods. So while red maples can have a faster growth rate, yeah, no hard and fast rules there. It's gonna really depend on the site and the conditions at that site. So not just the soils, but how crowded they are. How old is that red maple versus that sugar maple? Did it have access to sunlight? All that stuff. You know what I mean? That's a very unhelpful answer, but it's kind of, that's what I got.
Because I've had sometimes a theory, and again, as you said, it depends on those variables, but if the tree looks like it's in a good growing condition, maybe I'm more willing to tap an 8-inch red maple or a sugar maple, I'd wait till 10. But like you said, it also depends on the canopy, how much sunlight it has in the site.
Yeah, and again, with red maples, I do have a little bit more, internally, I have a little bit more caution about tapping a smaller red maple, again, because of that potential for that central column. In a smaller red maple, you increase your chances of drilling right into that. So it's, you know, like I said, there's a lot of different factors to balance.
Yeah, for sure.
The number of taps based upon diameter, is that the same with red maple as sugar, or would you recommend doing fewer?
That's a really, I sort of heard that enough to say it's a really interesting question. I would, based on the data that we have now, I would say that there is no difference to treat the diameter for adding a second tap hole in red maple any differently than that in sugar maple. However, that, what do I want to say there? Yes, I'm just going to leave it at that. And like, so in my earlier talk, one of the highlights from research that we've done recently on the number of taps per tree is that the smaller the tree, the higher the vacuum, the less you gain from adding a second tap. So if you are in that 18-inch sort of cuspy area of diameter where you're going to be thinking about adding a second tap, if you're at high vacuum levels, whether it's a red maple or a sugar maple, that is a little bit, you know, the bigger the tree, the better off you are for adding that second, the more gain you would get. The smaller the tree, the less gain you would get, sugar or red maple.
In your commercial operation, if you hit either in a sugar or a red hardwood or stained wood, do you tap it anyway? Do you leave it untapped, or do you drill a new hole?
That is the $1 million question, but you asked me what we do in our operation, so I can totally tell you the answer for us. Generally speaking, in most areas of our woods, if we hit non-conductive wood, we are going to leave that tree alone. We're going to plug the drop line and let it go. This is because in many areas of our woods, we have had a fairly substantial buildup of non-conductive wood over time. Slow growth rates, 7/16 taps until 2004. I mean, and maybe some PFA thrown in there too. So it's those trees were, a lot of trees are difficult to find conductive wood on. So if we hit it, we're gonna leave it alone. Other areas, if you have fantastic growth rates, a super healthy tree, and you hit that old tap hole or non-conductive wood because you were spaced out and you didn't really look at where you were tapping, for example. It's not you're hitting it because there's a massive amount of non-conductive wood built up from previous tapping. In a condition like that, I might put in the second tap hole, of course, far enough away so that's not going to make a leak with the hole that I just made. So really the answer is very situationally dependent, and the thing that I think is important to keep in mind is when you're answering that question for yourself, what do? Is these are my trees, or these are the trees in my maple operation. How long do I want it to be a good yielding crop tree for me? Do I want it? Am I in this for 5 years and done? Most likely you're not going to be. You're in this for the long haul. So that's the question I would advise you to ask yourself when you're like dancing with that question. If you need another factor to kind of push the answer home, you know what I mean?
Well, it's kind of like the maple trees, depends on your age, whether you're gonna do it another 5 years or 50 years, so.
Well, maybe you're only in it for 5 more, but I bet you've got plans for who's in it for the next 20 or 50.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
But would you come back and tap that tree next year, or do you take it offline completely?
It's a really good question. Again, that depends on the situation. Like, did I hit brown wood and then there's a gigantic leak because there's a hole in the middle of the tree, like it's a complete cavity tree? Yeah. Is it really depends on the condition of the tree. How good are the growth rates? Is this an area where I've never tapped below the lateral? So maybe next year I'm going to come tap it below the lateral, or is it in really bad shape? So maybe I want to give it a year or 2 off. It really, again, does depend on the situation.
Other questions?
Are you
It
gonna
can
do
be
the
on
SAP,
everything, but, oh, sorry.
are you gonna do the SAP study again since it seems like you're doing the boiling syrup this year? Are you doing the whole study again for 2022?
Well, the idea of the SAP yield study was to do it for 2 years, and that was going to be sufficient. And it probably is. But I'm going, because 2021 was so weird, I'm going to try and get funding to do it not this year, but in 2023. There's a limitation in like human hours to do a syrup experiment and a yield experiment, too many yield experiments at the same time. So it won't be this year. If I can get funding, I'd like to do it one more time just to really get some fine-tuned data, daily yields and things like that. But based on what I saw, even in the weird year of 2021, doesn't give me, I feel fairly comfortable saying that all things being equal, the yields are pretty similar to sugar maple.
Individual tree measurements are very time consuming.
Especially with red maple. That's the lesson learned. You know, I know as an intellectual fact that red maples produce copious volumes of sap. Why I didn't think about that when I was hanging the same size chambers that I've always used for sugar maple on those red maples that were 18 inches. Yeah, my very overworked technician was collecting sap at 11 at night, at 3 in the morning. It was, yeah, it's very time consuming. And there are 86 trees, 86 chambers to measure in that study. Awesome.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
In regards to the flavor and taste of the sugar versus the red maple, I'm not a tree expert. Does the maple tend to have a little bit different preference for soil type, like maybe a little bit sandier versus a sugar maple that you would speculate is going to have probably some of those characteristic differences in regards to flavor?
Sorry, Adam, I couldn't hear.
Yep. So the question is thinking about flavor of maple syrup, and then kind of, you know, do red maples prefer different soil types in the sugar maple? And then if so, would those different soil types that they grow on impact the flavor?
Speculative, yeah.
Speculative. speculate.
Yeah.
You haven't
To
done
be
that.
honest, we we can only speculate about soil properties impacts on sugar maple flavor. It is still very far beyond what we've been able to do the kind of intensely difficult experiment necessary to quantify some of those things. The variables that are likely to vary, that are a little bit more within our reach of being able to study, there are likely to be different components of secondary compounds in red maple sap than sugar maple sap. It is at least within the realm of possibility that the concentration of some of those versus some that maybe are less present in one versus the other, that could translate to an impact, but that's a very low likelihood. The vast majority of not the vast majority, but the things that have the biggest sort of heavy-handed impacts on syrup flavor as it develops are the ways that microbes interact with that sap, and then subsequently our conditions for processing. And so those things being said, if we're keeping all of our processing variables the same and our collection variables the same, my hypothesis is that there will be differences, any differences that are likely to be there from very, very, very nuanced things like differences in secondary compounds or differences that might arise from soil type are going to be overwhelmed by differences that will be caused by processing or microbes, sap collection issues. And since those two things are going to be kept equal, my hypothesis is that it will be fairly similar when we see the syrup. But I'm happy to be surprised. I'm ready. I would love it.
Red maples typically grow on wetter soils and wide variety of soils, but correct me if I'm wrong, but in your study, the sugars and reds are pretty much in the same stand. You said, right?
Yes, they are. We worked hard to make them as mixed as possible. They're from a, it's actually kind of, it's a hilarious setup, but they're from several different areas of our sugar bush, but they are mixed in with each other in those areas. So that part should be equal. And to kind of take a bigger look at your question, looking at the potential impacts of those subtle factors like geology and soils and God knows all those other things, those are definitely things that we want to answer in the future. It's just a long road to get to some of those more nuanced questions. And we really need to tackle the bigger things first. If we have not a great handle on even processing factors and sap collection factors, like we want to hit those too. And we're hoping for a better understanding of all of it in the next 20 or 30 years.
Question I have for you, kind of building on that, based on a conversation I had with Lyle Murley in the Holiday Inn Express this morning.
Where much good science has begun.
The breakfast room. I know you haven't made syrup yet, but have you looked at anything within the sap, like invert sugar levels?
Right, we have not looked at invert. That sap yield study was just sap yield. We have not looked at invert levels. We will when we collect the syrup this year, because obviously if there were a difference, if there is a difference in invert level sort of inherently between sugar and red maple sap, that would absolutely affect how syrup flavor developed. So we shall see. I have no data. I have not enough to go on to say that there's a difference there in the invert level between one and the other at this point. But if it is there, it could definitely affect flavor.
So Lyle's not in the room, but Eileen Downs is in the room here.
Well, I know they have some data from what they do. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and Abby, you know Lyle really well, so of course you can't wait for the data.
I know.
And Eileen, you guys measured a little bit that found lower invert levels in red maple, right?
Yes, we found that a line that had a red maple on it frequently had almost no inverted sugar in it. And we found that kind of by mistake one day, because I thought, oh, this tree's got a woodpecker, you know, chopping away at the top of it. Let's test this one. I got absolutely 0 for invert level. And I expected all kinds of microbes and bacteria and everything. And the more we looked into it, the red maple seemed to always have almost no inverted sugar.
Yeah, it
So
is.
it's very interesting.
Yeah, and it is like, there is logic behind why that would happen. Red maple is full of extra secondary compounds that are not in red maple, things that tend to be antimicrobial, at least in the leaves, right? We know much less about the sap than we do the rest of the plant. So, you know, there are lots of things that won't eat red maple, and the reason that they don't eat it is because they have these phenolics and other secondary compounds, and some of them are antimicrobial. So it follows, you can like make the case for maybe some of those are preventing microorganism growth in the sap. So it's at least possible, and I can make a case for it. So I'll be excited to see the data for sure.
Now, Navindra serum from University of Rhode Island, he has looked at that a little bit in some of the different compounds in red maple syrup versus sugar maple, right? I can't remember if it was syrup or sap.
If he has sap data, I'm not sure if he's published it widely, but he may have some data.
In a conversation I had with one of our podcast, Sweet Talk podcast episodes when I interviewed him, he had referenced that he did not see a difference between the red and sugar as far as inverts and other compounds that was drastically between red and silver. My guess was it was probably sap and not syrup, because
Yeah.
probably it's hard to, you know, how many people are tapping just red maples and boiling that down, right?
I'm in it. And I don't recommend it. Installing the system to get enough trees on separate lines, it's, you know, we like to say this, Adam is the same way. We do the crazy things so that you don't have to. I would not wish this on anyone else. And we'll be collecting sap from this system for, you know, for our operation after this experiment is done for years and years. And it's like this bizarre system of separated main lines and laterals. It's a mess.
How many red maples will you have in the system this year? Because you also need to have enough taps to be able to fill the evaporator, right? Like,
Yes, it is my personal nightmare right now. We have 500 of each species. So it is like the bare minimum to be able to have enough sap volume to have a sufficient volume of concentrate to flood both evaporators and run them for a realistic amount of time. You know, you can't just like, oh, I have 100 gallons of concentrate and make syrup. Like, that's not an experiment that represents what you guys do out in the real world. So yeah, it's gonna be fun.
earlier when you were talking, I had the thought that I'm glad you're doing it, so I don't have to.
I think about that all the time when you tell me what you're doing. Like, you've got trees tapped right now. Ha ha, I'm glad I'm not doing that.
True.
I'm embarrassed to ask the question, but I do not know, what is invert sugar?
That is a fantastic question, and you should not be embarrassed about asking it. Invert sugar, so the sap pure in the tree before it has been affected by anything else, sap going around the sugar maple or maple trees is predominantly sucrose. And sucrose is made up of a molecule of glucose and fructose bonded together. And so when we're talking about invert sugar is just when sucrose has been broken up into glucose and fructose. And in our world, in maple production, that happens only after the sap exits the tree. So it is mainly the work of microbes that split that apart. And the beauty of it is we depend the reactions that make color and flavor when we process sap into syrup happen way way better with invert sugar than with sucrose. So if we have more invert, we have more color and flavor. But if we have too much invert, we might have more color and flavor than we want. But anyway, part of the magic of the process. But invert is just that sucrose split apart.
Sucrose and fructose are split.
Sucrose
And
is glucose and fructose.
glucose. and fructose.
Yeah, glucose and fructose split. So, and that's also why Eileen cares is when it comes to making confections, if your inverts are too high, invert sugars don't crystallize. And so if your invert level in your syrup, so that's why you typically, oftentimes you don't use really late season syrup. When you have the darker syrups have more inverts, you can't make different confections.
Yeah, and weirdly, though, although that relationship tends to hold, you know, later season, you are likely to have more microbial action and more invert. We did a study back when I was a baby maple researcher, and we looked at the invert levels in relative to color grade, and we found that no relationship whatsoever between the color of syrup and the invert level. It was just all over the map.
True, and that's why it's always good to measure invert sugar when you're before you make confections, right, Eileen?
Which is something that Eileen does in her sleep, right?
And Eileen has as part of the Western New York maple producers, you have a YSI.
Yeah, bioanalyzer, which can measure invert sugar down to basically nothing. You can measure with a glucosameter because you're forming glucose in your, once the sucrose is broken up. You have to dilute it 1 to 10 because it's too strong for the glucosameter otherwise. But the bioanalyzer, that'll only, the glucosameter will only go down to 20 %, which is 20 milligrams per deciliter, which is 0.05% invert. Whereas the YSI, it's housed at Merlin Maple, and we do samples for other people also, but it'll go down to basically no glucose in there. So I mean, I can get a better reading. I can take sap and run it on the YSI. I can't get a reading off of the glucose meter because there's not enough concentration. So I mean, I can measure our sap tanks, say, and tell Lyle, okay, these lines need to be washed in between runs.
But
So you
not
can-
too much, right? Because you want strong.
Well, yeah, but I mean, some of our syrup gets up to 12 and 13% inverted. So it has a really strong taste. It might still have an amber color, but it's going to have a very strong taste because there's so much fructose and glucose, which are much sweeter and much stronger tasting.
Yeah, and it lend that sort of molassesy flavor that some people
Yes.
love and some people will in maple.
Yeah,
And if you're, go ahead.
I grew up on golden syrup, so I am not a lover of molasses flavor.
I won't
If-
say that I grew up on molasses and never mind. That's a story for another day.
Just leave it there.
Well, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Like any topic is open.
I'll just do a plug too, that if you're interested in measuring invert sugars, you're on your own using like the glucose meter. If you go to cornellmaple.com for our videos, we have a little video that walks through the steps how you can do that. So the glucose meter is what a diabetic uses. So there's certain brands that work better. So you can buy them. I think they're like $30 or $40, less than $50 usually. You have to dilute it in water because the sugars are too high in syrup. You have to dilute it a little bit, but you can measure your invert levels on your own. So yeah, so other questions anybody has on other topics or just
as long as we're on the topic of invert, is there any possibility that, like when you put up syrup at the end during the sugaring season and you test the invert of it at that point in time, can it or will it change while it sits in the barrel over, say, 6 months?
Yes, but I am not an expert at that. And I would actually defer to Eileen. She probably knows better than anyone.
It's gonna depend mostly on how clean your barrel is. If for some reason you have any, especially yeast or microbes in that barrel, it could invert some of your syrup over while it's being stored, even if it's being stored cold. Cold helps keep it from inverting, but it will not totally prevent it. We actually use an enzyme called invertase and invert drums of syrup when I'm going to be making the maple spread and maple cream. So, I mean, and we store it in the cooler and it continues to invert while it's in there.
Which I have to make a note, just that for people like in Vermont and other jurisdictions, the use of invertase is actually prohibited for products. So we have to be very careful about that.
Yeah, no, I forgot about that, Ed, sorry. In New York State, it's a process aid.
Right.
We're allowed to use it.
And I would say the only data that I have on it was from a peripheral study that we did on air injection years ago. We were measuring the stability of color and invert in storage in retail containers in that study. And after 6 months, we saw no difference in the invert level, but that was only 6 months. So that's kind of a limited data set for your question, and probably Eileen's experience is a better to draw on there.
I mean, it should be, you're filling your drums hot, so it should be sterile, but I'm not gonna say that they never change.
Did you, not to steal away from, because Eileen's presenting on a jug study just after lunch, right? And did you see any differences in invert and retail packaging over time?
I didn't, yes, well, I didn't know, you know what, that is something I have not done.
Okay.
I tested 3 different invert levels, and that's what I'm
That you worked on.
giving the
but-
results on.
Okay.
But that's actually a really good point. I need to go back and test the invert.
How that's done.
Last
Okay.
year. There's so much, you know, so many variables.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Other questions?
Can you see us?
A tiny bit. So if you're making faces at me, I totally can't see. Oh, you're all wearing masks anyway.
Yeah, you can't tell anyways. Other questions? All right, if you want to ask questions individually, Abby, you can come up front, talk right in the camera on too. So thank you, Abby.
Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy your lunch.